Hi, and welcome back. I'm Hank Preston, a developer evangelist with Cisco DevNet, and today I want to talk to you about Ansible Part 1, what you need to know to get started using Ansible. This content is part of our Network Programmability Basics video course and is contained within our Net DevOps module. Inside this module, we've already talked about configuration management in the network and why it matters and why we might want to leverage it. And now we're going to spend the next 3 lessons talking specifically about Ansible, a common configuration management tool used for network programmability. If you want to follow along with me in this lab and this lesson, by all means do so. Jump up to github.com/cisco-devnet/netprog_basics and you can download or clone all of the code and README information necessary to execute all of the labs in the video course. Every lab includes a README that details all the prerequisites necessary to set up your infrastructure, your workstation, your laptop, so that you can follow along with me. Now for the access to the infrastructure that we're leveraging in these exercises, DevNet Sandbox is ready to go. Every lab README indicates which sandbox you should go ahead and reserve or which sandbox you're going to take advantage of with these exercises that we're looking at. In our lesson today, what we're going to start out with is why you might want to learn Ansible and what capabilities it offers and some of the core elements for it. We'll look at how you set up your workstation or your environment to use Ansible. We'll talk about the key components of Ansible, including modules, tasks, plays, playbooks, all the way up to roles. And then we'll end with a discussion about how you can use variables, loops, and templates inside of your playbooks to do your customization. So why learn Ansible? What does it offer to you and how does it work as far as a network programmability use case might go? Well, we'll start out here where we'll just deal with where Ansible started, which was with VMs and system and server administration. So suppose you're sitting around and you need to get some information about all of the virtual machines or servers in your environment. Let's say that you want to make sure all of the routes that are necessary on your VMs are deployed. Now there's lots of ways that you could do this, but clearly you don't want to log in SSH 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 100 of those VMs. Ansible gives us the ability to very quickly send that type of command out to all of the servers by using Ansible and then targeting a shell module that lets us execute commands. And we can run our netstat against our entire data center full of servers automatically and report that back. Excuse me. After we've taken a look at that and noted that we are indeed missing a couple of routes on maybe some or all of our servers, we can follow that command up with another Ansible command where we actually add a route to all of the servers in the data center just that quickly to verify that our entire data center is compliant with what our settings are. Now Ansible is not just about individual ad hoc commands like this. We can actually do full workflow orchestration. Now let's move to this concept where we sit down and we find out that our application, maybe it has a bug that's involved or our developers have added a new feature that we want to deploy. We have our setup with a production and stage environment in place. We can use Ansible to very quickly deploy application changes to our stage environment and let us verify that they were successfully deployed and working as expected. Our workflow inside of Ansible can then, once that verification is done, update our load balancers to swap production and stage. So our newly updated stage environment now becomes production, while our previous production environment is moved to stage. Now how Ansible works is you start out with your Ansible control station. This is the environment, the server, your workstation that you're going to actually run and execute Ansible from. You will build Ansible playbooks written in YAML on the control station or build them someplace else and deploy them to your control station. Once you've got them ready, you use Ansible to go ahead and package up all of the information necessary to execute your configurations as designed and package them up and copy them to the destination remote host to execute the tasks. Now Ansible modules and Ansible content is typically written in Python, and so the modules, the code, everything necessary to execute what you've described inside of Ansible is all copied up to those end hosts and deployed at the edge. Now that you're excited about this, and I know that you are, let's talk about how you can quickly get started with your own Ansible control station. And that's where this all does start, is you need a place to run Ansible. Now any Linux host or Unix-based host, such as even Macintosh, a Mac Pro workstation or laptop, can be used to deploy and manage act as your Ansible control station. You need Python installed because Ansible is indeed written in Python itself. Your control station needs to support the transport protocols used to connect to the remote hosts. Now that typically is SSH, but some Ansible modules may leverage an API to connect to different remote hosts. And we'll see that when we talk about using Ansible with network devices. Once you've installed Ansible, there are 4 components you'll need to set up to get started. You'll need your Ansible configuration file that determines how your individual instance of Ansible will work, or different use cases when you go through. An inventory file describes all of the hosts or groups of hosts that you're going to manage using Ansible. And then all of the modules that determine what are the capabilities that you can do in Ansible when you're trying to target all of the servers in your inventory. And then finally are the playbooks. The playbooks define exactly what it is you want your servers and your environment to look like. We will walk through each element of this in this lesson. Starting out with the installation. Now, as I mentioned, Ansible is written in Python. And so you need either Python 2.6 or 2.7, which is the currently general availability, kind of supported version of Ansible. Python 3 is currently supported, but it's in tech preview. So if you're just getting started with Ansible, it's probably safe to start with Python 2.7, and the latest version of 2.7 would be my recommendation. Once you have that set up, you can just pip install Ansible like any other Ansible library or package and get going from there. Now, the configuration file for Ansible is how you actually control the operation of the Ansible process as it goes through. Now, Ansible, once installed, will come with a default configuration that you can find in the etc Ansible directory, but you may want to override some of those defaults. Where you would override those kind of go up in, or which settings are actually supported go up starting with the actual global Ansible config, and then it would take a look at the .ansible.config file located in the home directory. But the most common way that you might use is storing an ansible.config, not a hidden .ansible.config, but an actual ansible.config in the current directory where you're executing Ansible from. Inside of there, you would then specify whatever settings you might want to go through. If we look at the example here, we can see that we're specifying a specific where to find the inventory file. We're disabling host key checking to make it easier for our lab testing. And then finally, we're specifying the location of where to find the roles. We'll talk more about roles in just a bit. Now, for documentation and information about all of the Ansible options that you may want to configure in the configuration file, check the full Ansible documentation linked to here. The next step after this is how can we actually authenticate to our end servers that we want to manage. Now, the typical and the default behavior and the recommended method for authentication is to use SSH with keys. Ansible actually assumes that there's keys already set up to use. Now, in our screenshot here, let's take a look at how we would actually do that. Now, the first step to use keys is to actually generate an SSH key that we would use. Now, boxed in red, we can see our SSH keygen command. And this lets us set up an RSA key pair, public-private key pair, on our control station. Now, as you go through, you can specify passphrases or all of your typical good security practices for SSH keys. But what we can see is that we've created a new RSA key pair called ID RSA, and it's stored in the default .ssh directory under our profile. Now, with our SSH keys created on our control station, the next step is to copy that up to all of the inventory hosts that we might use. Now, indeed, we could probably use Ansible for this, or you could bake it into the images that you use. But for lab testing, it's really easy just to use the SSH copy ID command inside of Linux, and then to copy that new key up to your end hosts. So here we can see we're copying the key up to our particular host in this place. Once that key is copied up, we can then log directly in using SSH to that end host without having to provide a password. Now, speaking of passwords, sometimes you may have to use passwords. In effect, network devices will often use passwords with Ansible. We'll talk more about how you can use that inside of the next lesson when we look at Ansible with network configuration. Now, the next bit of Ansible we want to talk about is the inventory file. The inventory file defines all of the hosts and groups of hosts that are under Ansible management. Now, you can store your inventory file anywhere, but typically what we'll find is a file called hosts in the local directory or the current directory that you're working in. Now, hosts can be identified by IP address or fully qualified domain name. And here in the example boxed off in green, we can see that we've identified our host by IP address. Now, you can create many different groups inside of your inventory file by using square brackets and then listing out individual hosts underneath it. Now, one other piece of kind of a hint and wisdom here, when you set up your inventory file, what I have found is that it's good to include this specific host parameter inside of my inventory file because I'm a big fan of using virtual environments with all of my Python use cases. Ansible by default would just default back to the default Python environment on your control station, unless you specify and override that using the Ansible Python interpreter option in your inventory file. I've gotten to the point where I just default to include that always because that was the safest solution that we have when working with Ansible. Now, when we install Ansible, there's actually more than one CLI tool or more than one tool included in the Ansible libraries that we downloaded. We do have Ansible, and we saw examples of that at the beginning of this lesson. And Ansible can be used to execute ad hoc single modules against target hosts. We can do that without creating a full playbook. That's great for ad hoc commands. Now, Ansible Playbook is when we actually take those articulated, defined workflows written in playbooks and run those against a targeted set of hosts from our inventory. If you have sensitive data that you don't want to provide in clear text inside of playbooks and YAML files, you can use Ansible Vault to encrypt that information. Now, we talked about how Ansible works in a push model, where on the control station you run Ansible and it pushes all of the configuration information up to the end hosts. You can reverse that by using Ansible pull and let your clients pull information from a centralized server. That's not the most often way that Ansible is used, but it is supported. Ansible-docs lets you parse doc strings for documentation and help information about individual modules. And then finally, with Ansible Galaxy, you can download roles or create new roles that you may use to articulate specific capabilities with multiple playbooks inside of your environment. Now, if we want to use the Ansible CLI for ad hoc commands, here's an example of how we would dive through it. Now, again, the Ansible CLI would be leveraged to run an ad hoc command against it, so we can see that we're using Ansible at the command line. The first bit of information we have to specify is which Ansible module we want to use. In this case, we're using what's a default setup module that Ansible comes with, which actually just gathers all of the facts and information about the host that it targets. The next bit that we've got in our example here is -u root, shown in yellow. Now, by default, Ansible will run its playbooks and try to leverage the local username that you've logged into the control station as. Now, if that's not what your end hosts are actually using, you can override that with -u. In this case, I'm going to use the root username to connect to my servers. And then lastly, we specify the server or group of servers that we want to connect to. And this needs to reference and correspond to something that exists inside of your host inventory file. Now, if the module you're using requires arguments or specific details to configure that module appropriately, you would use -a and then the argument information as well within that Ansible command that's there. Now that we've looked at this running specific Ansible commands with ad hoc, now let's look how you'll more often use it, which is the creation of playbooks, where you combine different plays and tasks, leveraging modules inside of it. Now, if we talk about the different terms that are going through here and look at the hierarchy inside of Ansible, I think that'll help us as we continue our discussion. At the smallest byte, we end up with a module. The module is the code, typically written in Python, that knows how to perform some action on a host. These aren't tied to a specific host or capability. It's a generic function written in Python that knows how to do something. For example, you'll have a module for yum. The yum module in Ansible knows how to manage packages using the yum package manager. We'll also have modules to work with our Nexus devices and our iOS devices. Our modules on how to take advantage of apt if you're using a Debian-style Linux environment. The next step up are tasks. A task in Ansible is a single action that references and uses one of those modules along with any other input arguments necessary to customize that module's actions. Tasks are combined with the host to execute those tasks against inside of a play. And then we have the next layer up, which is our playbooks. A playbook is the YAML file that includes one or more plays. Those plays will include references to hosts based on the inventory file and all the tasks, and those tasks again use modules. Now, if you find yourself creating complex playbooks that you repeatedly use over and over to do the same tasks, or to configure your servers in the same way, you may find roles a handy use case to leverage. A role is a pre-built set of playbooks designed to perform that standard configuration in a repeatable fashion. Now, you may have a role that would configure an Apache web server that would go ahead and install Apache, configure it appropriately, update the firewall, and copy any application files necessary. Inside of your playbook, an individual play would reference the role rather than tasks. And then they all get inherited inside the playbook as it goes through. Now let's dive into this Ansible playbook example and see how those bits between modules, tasks, plays, and roles all come together. As we can see in our example here, the Ansible playbook is indeed written in YAML. So if we go back to the earlier session we had on data formats, we're going to see where YAML comes back at us for a configuration file here. The first thing we want to look at here in blue is where we've got all of the individual plays that make up tasks. So inside of this example, we have two plays. We have the first play here at the top, and then we have a second play at the bottom. The first play has a name of report hostname and operating system details, and will execute against all of the servers that are stored, the servers group inside of the inventory file. This first play has two tasks that go through, so we can see the tasks that are outlined, the first task and the second task. The first task goes and retrieves the hostname from the server, while the second task actually prints out the operating system that's there. Now what we can see inside the tasks is we have modules, and those modules may have parameters that are there. Here boxed in red, we can see our debug module is being used. The debug module is a way to very easily write out messages on the Ansible control station about what's going on. The debug module requires a parameter of what message to write, and we can see there. Now we can see throughout the playbook we see references to variables, and variables are identified inside of an Ansible playbook using the double curly braces, and we can see that here outlined in green. Now what variables we have access to is actually a great topic, and we're going to dive more into that in just a second. But one thing we want to notice is that just by the nature of using Ansible and connecting in and managing servers, there are a whole suite of variables that are available based on what we call facts inside of an Ansible setup. So as Ansible connects off to each host, it gathers those facts and then registers all of those as different variables we can use. We can see those embedded ones here as referenced with Ansible_distribution, which ties back to the operating system in use. Down here below, we can also see where we're using Ansible default IPv4 interface to find out the default IP address that's being used on the machine. You can also register your own variables by taking the output from one task and using it later on. And so here we can see that we are retrieving the network routes using the command module and executing as simply netstat-rn, and then we register the output of that command as a variable called routes. We can then use that later on in this task, the third task in this play, and we just print that out using the debug task. When we run this playbook to see what the output looks like, we can see that here. We've run our playbook using Ansible playbook as the command line. We're running this as the root user, and our playbook was called example1.yaml. Now I've edited the output here on the slide, but this gives us a high level of all of the steps that are involved. We can see the indication of the two plays. We've got our first play and our second play that are running. And then inside of each play, we have our tasks that run. We've got one task and two tasks. Now every task is executed against the matching hosts from the inventory file, and then we'll see those indicated with OK messages showing successful indications. At the end of the full playbook running, we get a play recap, where we actually list out each individual host and whether it was successful or if there were any fails or errors that went through. Now that we've seen how we can create playbooks and looked at some of the details in there, let's dive a little bit deeper into variables, loops, and templates and how those might be used. There are lots of ways to get variables into your Ansible playbooks, but a common one is to actually create a separate YAML file that lists all of your variables and then include those inside of your playbooks using a vars file key. Now once you've done that, you can reference those variables by just using the double curly braces and then the name of the variable that's in there. Now if you want to loop and create looped actions, here in blue we can see how we can actually loop over elements. So in this example, in our external variable file, we have a list of quotes. And then in blue we can see with items quotes, we want to go ahead and execute a debug command against each one of those and print out the item and the message that's there. This type of flexibility for external variable files Referencing those and using loops is a common activity inside of Ansible playbooks. Here we can see this example running in execution. We can see that we've gone ahead and we're executing our illustrate variables play, and then down underneath the task of loop over the list, we're printing out each individual quote from that list that was stored in the external variables file. We can take variables to the very extreme by using Jinja 2 templating. Now, Jinja 2 templating is not something just used in Ansible. It's a common method of creating templates and configuration files across lots of different languages and heavily used within Python. Now, inside of Jinja 2, you can do powerful templating control structures like loops and conditionals inside of there, but we can use it very simply inside of Ansible by using a template module that's there. We would reference a specific Jinja 2 template, in this case example3.j2. We can see that what the template looks like up here in the corner, and inside the template we indicate all of our variable placeholders that we're going to pass into the template. Then when we use the templates module, we provide the source of the template and then a destination of where we want that a final version of that configuration template created and used. In this example, we can see where we've run example3.yaml, which leverages that Jinja 2 templating. And then we output down at the bottom where we can see the actual final configuration, where we've pulled in variable information from the Ansible playbook, injected that into the template, and outputted, in this case, a basic BGP enablement configuration for use. Now, one last bit to talk about variables are two specific types of variables that you have access to with Ansible: host and group variables. Now, these variables are automatically available in all of your playbooks and execution. And how they work is in your local directory that you're working from, Ansible looks for a group vars and host vars directory. Now, inside of each one of those, you would specify a .yaml file for the group name.yaml or the host name or IP address.yaml. And then during execution, Ansible would then import these files automatically into the scope of context when it's executing a playbook against a particular host or against a particular host in a group. This is a great way to have common variables across all of the groups, maybe all of the switches, or specific environment variables for a particular host. So IP address information, host name information, configuration details at a host level basis. Take advantage of host and group variables so that you can make your playbooks more modular against all of your hosts that are out there. Now, in summary, let's take a look at what we've seen so far around Ansible. We started out with a description about what Ansible is and why we might want to learn it, and some basic examples of how it would work. We took a look at how we would set up our Ansible control station to get started to run run Ansible playbooks and Ansible ad hoc commands. We took a tour through playbooks and how they're constructed of plays, which leverage tasks and modules. And then lastly, we introduced complex methods, or we introduced the ability to use variables and external files, and then capabilities that are a little more complex and advanced, such as loops and templates inside of your playbook. Now, be sure after you finish up this video to follow up with this next video in the series where we dive specifically into using Ansible in the network space and how you get started in that area. Before you do that, though, if you didn't run the examples and the demonstrations along with me in the slides, make sure you do that before you move forward so you get hands-on and get your own control station and information set up for your own use cases. And then lastly, as always, be sure to join me up on DevNet at developer.cisco.com so that you can get access to learning labs, development sandboxes, and so much more. If you have any questions, either about Ansible or any of the other topics that are out there, feel free to come find me. You can find me via email or Spark at hapresto.cisco.com. You can find me up on Twitter at hfpreston or on GitHub at hpreston. Cisco DevNet is available also on Twitter, Facebook, and all the social medias, as well as GitHub at Cisco DevNet. Thanks for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you on the next one where we look at Ansible inside of the network.